podcast, Preventing Operator Assaults, is a helpful look at the problem of conflict in and on our community transit systems. We hope that by starting a discussion that includes practical tips and ideas, that we can keep transit operators safe in every community, whether they serve in an urban, rural, or tribal transit environment. This project is funded by a grant from the Federal Transit Administration to improve safety for professional bus drivers and public transit riders throughout the nation. Your host is best-selling author and Transit Unplugged podcast host, Paul Comfort.
Welcome to Preventing Driver Assault, a limited podcast series sponsored by the Federal Transit Administration to help drivers and operators and others learn about how to do just that, preventing driver assaults. We're excited today to have with us as our special guest, Charlotte DiBartolomeo, and our co-host, Kristen Joyner. Kristen?
Yes, thank you, Charlotte, for being here. Charlotte DiBartolomeo is the founder and CEO of Kite Project, a resilience-building firm working in both the transit and medical industry to mitigate the impact of trauma and burnout on their workforce. She earned her master's in conflict transformation from the School for International Training Graduate Institute. She studied post-conflict reconstruction in Bosnia and Croatia. Charlotte has trained both management and frontline employees in conflict de-escalation, crisis management, and employee engagement in the transit industry for 10 years. In addition, Charlotte is on staff at Drexel University in Philadelphia, where she developed and teaches a course in trauma-informed care.
Oh, thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, what a great background, Charlotte. Tell us a little bit about what you do there at Red Kite.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Paul, for having me and for Kristen joining with us. We are billed as trainers. Everyone thinks of us as trainers, and that's fine, but we're systems change folks. You know, there's a limitation to training. There's lots of wonderful things that can happen in the training room, but we look at particularly the industries that we work in as industries that have so much burnout and they're so high pressure that we need to look at the entire organization to see where perhaps some structures need to change in order for people to have better engagement and better employee experience. And some of that is just impossible because of the populations that people work with. So if we're working with medical folks or EMTs, we know that they're going to develop some symptoms of burnout and trauma just by nature of the job of working with people who are experiencing their own trauma. And the same with transit. But you can have organizations that are supportive and responsive to the employee, more than they already are, so that helps people feel like, oh, okay, somebody has my back. And there are lots of different kinds of consulting that we do within that range.
So, Charlotte, when we're talking about transit driver assaults, there's a lot that we can talk about that. We are in prevention mode, and I think that there's a support for everyone involved that needs to be layered into the training and into the prevention element. So, talk to us a little bit about mental health issues. How does that factor in, and what happens after an assault for the transit operator?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that is so true. You know, we have been working in transit since 2010, and we immediately recognized that while, yes, the folks that are in the front line are customer service representatives, they're also human service professionals because they work with people who have mental health issues and opiate addictions and homelessness. And all of those things can create a more difficult interaction between the professional and the customer that they're working with. And so we're always thinking about how can we train those folks as human service professionals, and we gave them those skills. But then the pandemic hit. And with that, all of that became even more difficult. It was front and center. There were masking or not masking. People were not getting the services that they need. It was a really difficult time. It continues to be. And so beyond the training room, there needs to be other system-wide initiatives in place. And we see that by, partnering with already existing social services in the community. So for instance, an agency cannot be expected to just be the roving a homeless shelter, which happens a lot, right? And so there needs to be some connection between the real homeless shelters that are out there. And we need to strengthen transit police programs like heat mapping and doing some training around that. And heat mapping is when you take a look at the map of your town or your city and you see that, well, where is most of the violence occurring? Where are most of the drug exchanges occurring? And then you put more police there. We need to do that more across the country. Also, creating a social service response team of crisis interventionists to, respond to individuals who are homeless and have opiate addictions and mental illness. And so, yes, the drivers, the cashiers, the maintenance custodians, anyone who's out there, they can build in some skills about how to deal with folks like this, but they need to have that backup. And of course, we need to be able to rely a little bit more on city government, or certainly liaison with city government to find out what they're doing so that we can have better partnerships with them. So I think those are the kinds of things that need to happen. But communication strategies are always really important here. We need to be able to communicate better to the communities that the transit agencies work with, but also within the transit agencies, the communication needs to happen in advance for the front line to know that they're supportive and that the police will be coming and that they will get help after, God forbid, an assault occurs.
Thank you, Charlotte. Tell us a little bit more about mental health issues and how they factor in.
Well, so we started training folks in trauma-informed care, because what we recognized was that a lot of people are walking around. There are whole populations that have collective trauma, and that's generally the case in urban centers where a collective trauma is when it's large populations that experience trauma or have developmental trauma from childhood up. And so they need extra support, and they don't necessarily respond to the usual de-escalation techniques, because when somebody has experienced trauma, it can create a very different response. People are trying to get their power back. And so they sometimes come across a bus operator, and if the bus operator gets very dismissive because somebody is being difficult and may show their irritation, that can indicate to the person who has some mental health issues, i.e. trauma, that this might be the place where I can get my power back. So I'm going to fight with this person. And so understanding that they need a special response to be able to de-escalate, I think is very important.
That's interesting. I know that training is not a one size fits all. So, and I think that in transit, maybe in other industries as well, we tend to want, okay, so we have this situation X, and we pull out Y is the way, that we respond to it. What training really does work, Charlotte?
Well, the training that works, I believe, is the training where we don't just teach skills, but we help people to change their attitudes. And because if they don't change their attitudes about the population that they're working with, they're not going to use the skills once they leave the classroom. They need to see that something different can happen if they do something different. And they also need to know why people act the way they do. And that's where I think the mental health training is so important. It's easy to get really burned out in this profession and the front line as a frontline worker, because you are a witness to the world. And right now, there are many populations that are in crisis. And so it's easy to say, what is wrong with that person? But we like for people to think about what happened to that person and to try to, regain their empathy. That doesn't mean that you are here to save everybody, but when you have more empathy and you can show empathy, you're likely to get a better response from the person that you're interacting with, even if that interaction is 10 seconds. And so we do a lot of role play. We kind of deconstruct the experiences that they have had out there. And then we help people to find better ways to handle these things. But we also, because we teach in the round, we teach in a circle, we are sure that most people in that room have a really good understanding of best practices, but they've kind of forgotten them. We get people who are 40-year veterans, and they have been doing this job really, really well. And they're sitting there with somebody who's maybe been on the job 3 years. And you might find the person who's been on the job 3 years is way more burned out than the person who's been there 40. And so that 40-year veteran will be such a great teacher in that room to share, hey, look, this is what I do. These are my best practices. These are my strategies. You want to go home at the end of the day. You don't need to collect that fare. You can check and request, sure, but it's not your money. You're really here to make sure that people get there safely and to provide a service. And then, of course, you're caring about people and making sure that they are having a good experience, but you don't have to be the enforcer here. And so those kinds of conversations occur. And I think that's very helpful for people to not hear it from us, but to hear it from other drivers.
That's good. Charlotte, this is a very interesting conversation. I think we want to continue it in episode 2 of this 2-part series. Kristen, what will we cover in the second part of this series?
Well, we'll do a quick recap on the first part, but I'd like to talk a little bit about transit agencies and drivers and how prevention, how we actually go about prevention, and what a multi-layered response might look like.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us today, Charlotte and Kristen, on this special podcast, Preventing Driver Assaults. I'm Paul Comfort. Stay safe out there.
All comments, tips, and ideas are the express opinion of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Transit Unplugged, the Federal Transit Administration, CTAA, SWTA, TTI, or their subsidiaries. Thanks for listening.